Hey everybody, it's Jonathan Small, and this is Right About Now.
1, 2, 3, hit me!
Right about now. Right about now. The Funk Soul Brother.
Welcome to the show. Got a really interesting show for you today. Dr. Rick Hanson will join us. Rick is a psychologist and an author who has written several best-selling books on the inner skills of personal well-being and psychological growth. He's a senior fellow at the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley and has been invited to speak at NASA, as well as Oxford and Harvard and Stanford, and of course, the Right About Now podcast. Dr. Hanson is a Buddhist, and he has taught at many major meditation centers around the world. And I first became aware of Dr. Hanson's work by listening to podcasts like I do almost every day now. I will take a walk around the neighborhood, break free of my COVID quarantine, and explore new podcasts. And I've been listening a lot to 10% Happier lately, which is Dan Harris's podcast. And even though I don't really meditate regularly, I've been very interested in what he has to say about what's going on in the world. And he has on some really interesting guests. And one of his guests that I really liked was Dr. Rick Hanson. And Dr. Hanson is just a brilliant guy. And what I really like about him is he combines what he's learned through studying Buddhism with neuroscience. So he puts science behind the metaphysical, which I very much appreciate because I like evidence-based teachings. I like things that have been proven to work. He shows effective ways that we can literally light up our brain circuits to build new neural circuitry that can do everything from relieve worry and stress and build confidence and happiness. The book that really put him on the map was called Buddha's Brain. And this year he wrote a follow-up to that best-selling book, and it's called Neurodarma. And in it, he shares 7 practices for strengthening your brain, strengthening your contentment, your inner peace. It's very practical, good advice, as you will see. I would say that I understood about 92% of what he said, maybe 90% of what he said. He is deep. He goes real deep. You have to almost listen to this a few times to understand what he's saying. But when you catch his drift, it is quite profound. So what does this mean for us as writers? Well, he talks a lot about the process of writing and how he approaches writing. I was thrilled to have him on the show because he was actually on a sabbatical, and his assistant had written me back to say, sorry, Dr. Hanson is not available. He's on a sabbatical. And then he intercepted the email and said, oh, no, I'll talk to John. I want to talk about writing. This seems like a really interesting topic. So that was pretty cool. And I am looking forward to sharing this with you and getting your feedback. So without any further delay, I bring you Dr. Rick Hanson. So Dr. Rick Hanson, welcome to the Right About Now podcast.
Jonathan, I'm really happy to be here. As we were chatting, it immediately piqued my interest in a very strong way. It touched my heart, actually, the notion of talking about writing. I think of myself as an amateur writer who just sort of has, made efforts in this domain and to whatever end. But the thought of being able to talk about it collaboratively with a peer is really exciting to me.
Well, if you're an amateur writer, I don't know what that makes professional, because you are quite a good writer, and you've definitely kept me engaged in all the books that I've read that you've written. And you've already written, you were saying you're working on your 7th book. How many books have you written so far?
6. Started out with Mother Nurture in 2002 from Penguin, soon after 9/11. And it was about the long-term care and health of mothers, which was a real interest of mine. I'm a clinical psychologist, a parent, and I worked with families, so I did that. And then after a bit of a hiatus, I wrote Buddha's Brain, which maybe I'm best known for. Then came Just One Thing, which is a series of 52 specific practices people can engage, like be grateful or smile or take in the good. Then Hardwiring Happiness, about growing psychological resources inside, drawing on positive neuroplasticity. That's a mouthful. Yeah. After that, I wrote Resilient with our son, based on developing 12 strengths in this model and framework I've created 12 strengths of different kinds, such as compassion or grit, aspiration, generosity. And then after that, I wrote Neurodarma. Neurodarma was number 6. which is really about the upper reaches of human potential, drawing on the Buddhist model of awakening in a very pragmatic and non-religious sense, informed by the latest neuroscience in very, very practical, everyday ways. That's kind of what I'm personally interested in myself, moving up the mountain of awakening as far as I can make it in this life, and learning from others who are farther along. And my last one, maybe last, number 7, will be Just One Thing for Love, in which I take the basic idea of these personal practices and apply them in the domain of relationships. Like, for example, one thing I've learned in my marriage is admit fault and move on. And that'll definitely be among the 52.
That one I have to, yes, I've tried to do this. So I admit fault, but when I admit fault, she moves on to the next fault. Well, we won't go there. This could become a therapy session very quickly when I have a psychologist on the line.
Yeah, well, that maybe she should read the book, including things like "Don't pile on."
Oh boy, that's something I should put on my refrigerator. Do not pile on. Okay, so I love how your work combines Buddhism with science, and I'm curious how you discovered Buddhism in your own life, because your track of your academic life was very much sort of science-based psychology. Talk to me about your discovery of Buddhism, how that came into your life.
Yeah. So I grew up in a intact lower middle class family in the suburbs of LA, kind of raised in a frame of being a casual Christian, Methodist, and Jesus definitely has touched me, but the whole structure of it all just didn't somehow speak deeply to me in the ways it was presented, at least. And so then I go off to college, 1969 to 74, boom, catch the wave of the whole human potential movement, cultural ferment, greening of America, everything. And wow, this was really great. And at the end of all that, my last little bit of UCLA, spring of 74, I had independent study units to take. And so I decided to investigate so-called 12 units of Eastern philosophy and religion. That's what it was called, which I'd never really encountered before at my very humdrum, sort of ordinary upbringing. And that just opened my eyes to a whole field of possibilities, including the Buddhist account that everything's connected and everything's changing. And if you get with that truth, you're going to reduce suffering and harm. But if you struggle with it, if you swim against the stream, that's going to grind on you and other people, in a nutshell. And there's obviously deeper profundities of that, but that's kind of the bottom line, right? And that just went, that's true. So I started meditating a little bit, kind of a goofball, but I realized, there's something really here. And that kind of set me on my way.
Yeah.
And then I sort of fiddled around, I would say, through my 20s and in my very early 30s. And then kind of mid 30s, I got really engaged with Buddhist teaching and understanding it and practicing it and eventually ending up teaching it. So that was one major thread.
Yeah. What do you think it was about that time in your life that made you get more engaged with something that you had discovered earlier?
I think I was like a lot of people. I was searching. Also, like a lot of people, I had done some healing on my kind of unhappy childhood, not traumatic, but unhappy. And also I'd experienced some growth. And then I looked around. It's sort of like when you stabilize a little, you look around and you go, is this it? Like, let's say you're outdoors. I have a lot of wilderness background. I think of it that way, metaphorically. I'm a metaphor kind of writer too. And, you're up out of the swamps. Okay. You made it a little bit to the foothills, and the foothills are cool. And if you want to hang there, that's super fine. Right. But there's some people, I guess, and I don't mean to imply that there's any particular virtue or superiority there. I suspect it's almost temperamental. There are just some people, when you get to the foothills, you look around at the mountains and you think, I'm going to take some steps in that direction. I don't know if I want to struggle to the top of Mount Everest, but each step seems worth taking in its own right. So that sort of drew me onward, I would say.
Yeah. And it's interesting how you, in your work, really, you believe the tenets of Buddhism and you live the tenets of Buddhism, but you like science to sort of help inform what about Buddhism, is really true, factually true, right? That's very important to you. Why is that?
Well, the Buddha himself was absolutely a deep empiricist. And if you read a good translation of the written record, as best we know, which was handed down orally before a surviving record appeared several centuries after he died. But that written record, if, for example, you just compare it in its quantity to the sayings attributed to Jesus in the New Testament, which, as Thomas Jefferson did, if you just collect those, suddenly you're dealing with, I don't know what the word count is, but it's under 10,000 words. or it's probably a lot less than that. But to compare it, the surviving written record of the Buddhist teachings are in single-spaced, texts that would be about 6 inches wide if they were lined up side by side on a bookshelf at a minimum. So there's a lot there. If you go into it, it's very pragmatic and very empirical. It's basically about what is actually true and what can we do on our own without implying that we're drawing on some supernatural or transcendental agency in our progression in practice. Well, that attitude of empiricism and pragmatism is completely consistent with science. And so there's a tremendous overlap. You see in the later developments of Buddhism, more of an involvement, especially culturally in, say, in Tibet, with things that might strike a Westerner as kind of weird or, something or other. And yet still there's a lot of profundity there. But the original teachings are very direct and, like I said, consistent with modern science. Now, there is an important scientific saying that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Yeah.
And there's ways in which scientific materialism has become a kind of strange dogmatism in the West in some circles that's at odds with the scientific spirit itself. Right. So just because we don't yet have an MRI study that somehow proves that, let's say, a regular practice of mindfulness and compassion helps people be happier and less of a jerk in their everyday life, I can kind of speak for myself there. Just because there's no MRI study of it doesn't mean it's not true. It's a very important point here. And there probably are ultimate matters that are really inherently outside the domain of science. Like, for example, you and I were married. You have a wife. I have a wife. You love your wife. No scientific study in the world can prove that. They're just outside the domain of science. It's impossible to prove it either way. But when you start to appreciate what's going on inside the coconut, like right now, you got 85 billion or so neurons. I've got 85 billion or so neurons sparkling away, another 100 billion or so support cells, neurons connected at network with several thousand other neurons on average, giving us several hundred trillion little microprocessors, right? The enchanted loom, as Charles Sherrington put it. When you start understanding more what's going on under the hood, how those underlying neurobiological processes are the physical basis for our not physical, yet still existent experiences, our intangible and yet still existing and real experiences, well, that can give you a lot of insight that flows both ways with a penetrating analysis of mental processes, such as in Buddhism, and you can also find it in other traditions, certainly. With that penetrating analysis of your experiences, you can start to form hypotheses about plausible underlying neurobiological processes that are the correlates of those or the basis of those physically, and investigate that scientifically. And you can go the other way. Through understanding some of what's actually happening in the hardware, you can deliberately do practices of one kind or another. This is really my own personal specialty. You could do practices of one kind or another that are targeted to stimulate underlying physical processes, thereby strengthening them in ways that support your own healing, functioning, growth, and even awakening. And that opportunity to know yourself both from the outside in, objectively through science, and subjectively from the inside out through experiential practice informed by wisdom, the meeting of those two is what I call Neurodarma. And wow, it's just a field that's full of opportunity.
Well, it's like a workout for the brain, or training your brain, right?
Yeah.
And I love that.
Good way to put it.
I love thinking about it that way. I think, for me, there's something about knowing that it's not just this kind of airy-fairy metaphysical thing we're talking about here, but there's actually things you can do with your brain that your brain is actually doing to strengthen your character.
When you use your mind, you're using your brain.
Well, that's interesting you bring up that point. You make a distinction between the mind and the brain. And I know this is like a very philosophical point, but I'd love to hear what is the difference between the mind and the brain? Yeah.
So clearly there are rocks. There is stuff. Okay, we just kind of grant.
Yeah.
There is matter, and energy is a unified E equals MC squared thingamajigger. Okay, that's really clear. And it seems also really clear that we individuals and other humans are having experiences. There is hearing, there is pain, there is pleasure. There are thoughts, there are emotions, there are desires. We can look out the window and we can see birds and squirrels. In my home, and we can study monkeys and mice. And it seems clear that they're having experiences too. Why experiences are inherently not material. So I'm going to use the word immaterial in the meaning of not material rather than irrelevant. So they're intangible. So we have these two fundamental aspects within the ordinary Big Bang universe, as best we know it here twirling around on planet Earth. Okay, there is matter and there are experiences. So, or to put it a little differently, there is matter and there is information. Okay, we grant that there is information. There are signals, there are meanings, and so forth. Information also is intangible. It too is immaterial. So it's clear now, increasingly, that the function of the nervous system is to process intangible information, to receive signals, to store information, to transform information, to communicate information in ways that remain quite scientifically unclear. Information flows through the nervous system, supported by flows of physical activity. Those information and neural processes are the basis for our experiences, for our phenomenology. Okay, that's what's going on. So for me, there's a clear distinction that's grounded in science, and it's a conventional distinction within neuropsychology between the physical processes of our body and the information-based intangible processes of our experiences. I define the mind as all the information represented by a nervous system. So in that sense, again, consistent with the way scientists routinely talk about it, squirrels have a mind. Their mind is much simpler than our mind because there is information processing going on at a very rudimentary level. Little tiny worms that are a millimeter long that have 302 neurons. Exactly 302. There is information processing there. So at some level, there's a mental activity, but it's incredibly simple. The mental activities of the animal are grounded in and constrained by and enabled by the architecture of their nervous system, which is also then embedded in other forms of information processing in the body, such as in the immune system. So that's how I talk about it. That's a kind of a complicated way of maybe putting it, but it's mind and matter both exist within the natural frame of the ordinary Big Bang universe. They co-determine each other. Physical processes constrain, condition, and construct mental processes. Mental processes enlist physical processes to proceed. And in their proceeding, the underlying physical processes that are the basis of our experiences leave lasting physical traces behind. Now, whatever might be outside the natural frame, all right, cosmic consciousness, universal mind, that's a different matter. But I think these questions are helpfully grounded when we bring them down to the level of squirrels, mice, and monkeys and lizards. And then it gets much clearer, I think.
Right. Humans they always complicate things.
Have you ever think about this weird one? Imagine a thought experiment. Every species on the planet gets one vote, and that will determine whether other species continue to exist. I think we would be outvoted just like that. I think dogs would vote for us. Cats might have to think about it. We might get...
My cat right now, who's meowing at my door, is right now saying, I would not vote for you because you're not letting me into this.
But it's humbling to appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah. Dogs love us. Cats can go either way. They're swing voters. So, okay, let's talk about the mind of the writer, the complicated mind, which is really the mind of anyone. But there are some thoughts that come kind of quickly to writers or creative people in general, thoughts that we entertain maybe more so than other people. And maybe that's why we write. I don't know. But one of the things I find that writers do a lot is they're very, very self-critical.
Yeah.
You know, as they're writing, the mind is saying, you're terrible. This is the worst thing ever. You know, there's a lot of doubt. And, you know, I think most people have a tendency to criticize themselves, maybe some people more than others. But is it your experience that creative people in general have a lot more self-doubt and inner critic is much more audible in their minds?
Well, I'm not sure that writers as a group are more self-critical than stay-at-home moms who are not writers or tennis players or elite, anybody who's trying to be good at something, let's say.
Stockbrokers. Right.
I wonder if, I'm not sure that. Now, on the other hand, I suspect, and maybe this is the distinction you're getting at, that writers, because you're spending a lot of time in the space between the sentences and the space between the words, right? And there you are, right? there you are with your own mind. And it's quiet.
You can't escape.
And writers too, because writing is generative, usually through internal processes. Occasionally it's collaborative, but it's typically not through conversation, it's internal. Then you're particularly vulnerable to the yapping of the critic, whose voice might be ordinarily kind of drowned out or just background noise in people whose productive activities are less internally generated. They're more externally focused. So like elite skateboarders, I don't know. Okay, great. So writing, critic. So what to do about it, huh?
Yeah. And what to do about it. And where is it coming from? I mean, is there something that's happening in your brain? Is it the way that our brains are set up that, this idea of Buddhism, we're always suffering?
We're
is there
not
something
always suffering?
Okay.
Well, that's a technical question that we could really get into that. But if in any moment, there's much of your experience of mind that is either neutral or pleasant.
Okay.
Minimally. I mean, there is suffering inevitably in all lives of various kinds. Okay. But that doesn't mean that life is suffering, because life is also the pleasure.
Right.
I'm just hanging with you here, Jonathan. A lot of fun.
Right.
Very cool.
I'm not suffering right now.
Right. And people might want to look at my book, Neurodarma, for some, kind of an exploration of this question. But okay. Yeah. Well, I think there's a distinction between guiding yourself and criticizing yourself. That's very important. And you can think of it externally. Like, let's say you want to do anything that involves producing something of quality or getting better at something. And I'll go to rock climbing, because like a background there. And it's a simple example. I've had guides who were quite firm. Stop whining, Hanson, and start climbing. Get up there.
Right.
You can do it. Keep going.
Yeah.
Or they're very direct, like, hey, we got to get going or we're going to suffer by night. And yet there's this quality of supportiveness. They're noting what's actually working well. They're giving correction in a way that's useful. They're building up rather than tearing down. We can also imagine people outside us, whether it's a rock climbing guide or a parent or a spouse or a friend or a teacher or a boss, who they're trying to help you do better maybe, but it comes with an edge, a tone. It's harsh. There's an absence of naming, if not praising, what's going well. That's critical. And so I think it's helpful to appreciate that people can perform at a peak level. They can perform really well without the collateral damage of all that criticism in the sense of harshness and wearing you down and harming yourself. And then the question is how to build up self-guiding and reduce the power of self-criticizing.
I think people think that motivates them. So how do you build up that self-guiding? So I think there's a sort of false thought or belief in a lot of people that I've got to be a little harder on myself. Don't be a wimp. That kind of like, man up, kind of whatever it is. And that is not productive. But I think a lot of us, maybe the way we were raised or the way culture informs our thoughts, that we think that that's a lot about how to deal with self-criticism. Like, come on, just get over it, and it doesn't seem to be the best way forward. So I'm curious what your approach would be to that kind of like I'm sure you've heard that voice when you're writing. Yeah. Well, maybe you haven't, or certainly when you were starting writing, because I think anybody when they're first writing, or, a little bit of a criticism that comes in and says, maybe this isn't right, or who am I to say this, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So I find a helpful way to think about it, maybe because I'm a therapist and also because I tend to think in metaphor, but imagine two committees inside yourself, two groups of people. Beings. And one is the guiding committee. I'll call it the caring committee, actually, deliberately. There's the caring committee, and then there's the attacking committee. Okay. And on the caring committee are, in my imagination, different voices, different energies, different kind of beings. Included in them is a very firm being who's just blunt. And in reality, like, well, if you ever want to produce it, you got to sit in the chair. As I said to our son a while ago, I had this blinding realization that there was a direct correlation between minutes of butt in the chair and words on the screen.
Yeah.
Whoa, who knew? Who knew, right?
You actually got to be there, yeah.
Yeah, so they're definitely on the caring committee, the guiding committee is a kind of tough coach. They're not mean about it. It's the way it is. Now, also, there's an energy, a voice that's compassionate, that recognizes this is hard. There's another voice or energy that is acknowledging, that is praising, like you're doing it, you're trying. Okay. There's another that is encouraging, that says you did well in the past. You know, there's this process where you have this idea, then you sit down and it's a struggle and it's a pain. And then finally you get some movement and then it gets better and then you get excited and then you're done and it's great. You know, you're going to get there, just hang in there.
Yeah.
Then over here, you have the attacking committee, which is comprised of these pushing, drive, got to do it. Who cares how you feel? Or deluded voices who say things like, no pain, no gain. You got to be in pain, or suffer. Or pain is fear leaving is weakness leaving your body. And a lot of them are internalizations of those kind of folks in your life. Your nasty stepsister yakking on you, that Little League coach from hell, your Ph.D. advisor. Later on, who knows? Your first.
But they're there. And for some reason, those voices are so much more louder than the ones that were really the compassionate voices, For some reason, we remember those. I don't know if our brain just sort of naturally remembers those.
That goes to the so-called negativity bias of the brain, making it, as I put it, like Velcro for bad experiences, but Teflon for positive ones.
Tell me about that, the negativity bias.
We are designed through evolution to do 5 things neurologically: scan for bad news, overfocus upon it, overreact to it, over-remember it, and then gradually become sensitized to it over time. There is what's called an optimism bias in some small area that's much milder and about things like, teenagers thinking they're going to be a rock star or a professional athlete, things like that, or underestimating the consequences of risky behavior. There's a little bit of that, but predominantly we have this negativity bias. And so that's one of the reasons why we tend to remember routinely bad news more than good news. We are more affected by a negative interaction with another person than a positive interaction, typically in our relationships. That's why there needs to be a quantity effect for positive interactions and positive messages, because negative ones have a quality effect. They have an impact effect. That's because back in the Serengeti Plains, if you missed out on a carrot, you would have a chance of one tomorrow. But if you failed to avoid that stick, that predator, that aggression in your band, no more carrots forever. So we have this negativity bias. Therefore, deliberately tilting toward what could be called the legitimate positive,
that's interesting.
The genuine positive, the actual objectively grounded good news about the outer world or your inner world, focusing on that is a way to compensate for the negativity bias and level the playing field. And it's a primary way to grow strengths inside that help you deal with the bad. I mean, for me, it's summarized really as deal with the bad and take in the good. Those 3 really are guiding principles, I think, in lots of ways.
So that's really interesting. That's part of the whole fight, flight, freeze, that we're wired that way to respond more to the negative, almost like a survival tool. So what are some practices you can do to, heighten your optimism bias, your positivity bias in your brain?
Yeah.
It's so interesting you talk about this, because I think of my kid and how he always, so I have a 14-year-old and an 11-year-old kids, and they always remember all the bad things. Like, when you ask them about their memories, right? They're always remembering, I remember the time that you didn't give me that ice cream, or when I fell and broke my hand. They never remember, don't we remember the incredible time we took you to Disneyland and you had, whatever it is. We take a trip to Europe, they remember all the terrible things that happened to them.
Yeah.
So how do we switch that in our own brains? I know it's a practice. I know it's not something we do overnight, but how do you do that?
That's really a deep question. First, we have to do the work that there is to do. There's no replacement for action, for virtuous conduct of one kind or another. That's a fancy phrase for, do your dishes, put the lid on the toilet down, the cap back on the toothpaste, stop at red lights, don't drink too much, don't harm, take reasonable action. There's no replacement for that. If you're a writer, sit and write, or stand and write, or walk and write, whatever it is, do the work, put in the hours, put in the time. There's no replacement for that. So let's just assume that that's in place. Then let's talk about what to do with what's inside our own minds. On the one hand, it's important to regulate those harmful, painful forces inside us. To, for example, get some distance from the critical voice, and to use a technique that's often employed, imagine that inner critic in a kind of silly, annoying way as something separate from the core of you. It's there. You're not psychotic, but you're not identified with it. Like I think of a silly cartoon villain out of a Disney movie. Okay. That's the voice of the critic. So there's some distance from it. Also, listen to what the critic says and decide for yourself what's useful. Be the chair of the committee. Everybody has something to say on the committee. The critic has a function. It's trying to help you, albeit in an unskillful way. Okay. What are the merits in whatever it has to say? And thank you for sharing. We got it here now. You're the chair of the committee, the central executive process, it's called. And then you go, enough. I got it. Now someone else can talk. Right? Yeah. Those are different things we can do. We can also do things like being alert to how rapidly we internalize harsh, painful, only partially true inputs of different kinds from editors or peers or other kinds of things, media. Be careful about that. Okay. But mainly grow the good. Constrain the bad, defuel the bad. Quit feeding and following. We tend to ally with or ruminate on the negative, the harmful, and we're feeding and following it. There's a lot of research that negative rumination is a major factor of unhappiness, if not psychopathology. And be careful, rumination, a little bit of that sucker goes a long way. Okay, mainly though, grow the good. And this is where positive neuroplasticity comes in, fancy way of talking about moving from states to traits. In other words, learning in the broadest sense. So if you want to grow the part of you that is self-encouraging in a realistic way, I don't believe in positive thinking. I believe in realistic thinking. If you want to grow motivation, say, when you have experiences of encouraging yourself, or let's say another person is validating of your work, slow down for a breath to take it in. There's a saying, neurons that fire together, wire together. The longer they fire together, the more they wire together. The richer the experience, try to slow it down and feel it in your body, not just register it conceptually. Oh, they liked my piece, or at least they didn't criticize my piece. Help yourself feel it. And also track what feels good about it, which the duration of the experience, the embodiment of it, and the reward value of it, the sense of it being pleasurable or meaningful, all of which foster the conversion of passing experiences into lasting physical changes in your nervous system, in your brain. You literally are beginning to gradually hardwire these qualities, these tendencies, these resources into yourself, like encouraging yourself or recognizing your value or motivating yourself. If there's a sense of reward from doing your writing, slow down to register it and relate it to the effort you put in and what you carved out and the choices you made to do the work, so that your brain the next time will be a little more reinforced in moving in that particular direction. So those are two examples of growing these forces and resources, let's say, in your inner caring committee. Other key experiences are compassion for yourself, a quality of sort of emotional support that's not wallowing in self-pity. It's just doing for yourself what you would for a friend. Like, yeah, this is really hard. It is hard. I got it. Okay. And, we got to keep going. And the gradual accumulation of each day, less fuel for the harsh, critical voices. They gradually start to wither, just defueling them, stop watering those weeds. And over here, water your garden, a breath at a time, half a dozen times a day, reinforce. And you can do this from the inside out, reinforce those positive qualities, those positive psychological capabilities and inclinations and feelings and moods and so forth, and sense of yourself, so that they actually grow stronger. What you practice grows stronger. Particularly if you slow down in the methods I've described here and also my other books, slow down to take in the good. So you gradually hardwire it into yourself.
I love this idea of slowing down. It just really resonates with me. I just feel like brain is just going a million miles an hour. And, there's so many different inputs coming in with emails and got to do this and I've got to do that. And, why'd that guy just say this? And, it's cacophony. And I think the practice, though, of slowing down and really observing the good, that comes, you are definitely a proponent of meditation in some form, right? Some ritual of taking time away from all those inputs and just being with yourself and your thoughts. Yeah. Is that really the best way of slowing down? And what would you recommend?
Yeah, I think if we think of like sports, say. There's what we do on the field, and then there's how we train off
Right.
the field. So it's definitely helpful to give ourselves a minute or more a day where we just come home to ourselves.
Mhm.
The way of that might be different for different people. One person might want to read the good word from the Bible. That's their way. Another person,
Right.
they're just going to go in the kitchen and make dinner, and kids, this is mom time. This is dad time. This is me time. Other person will do some yoga, or they'll walk the dog, or they'll sit down in a chair, close their eyes, and just be aware of their breathing for a minute or more, whatever it is. So it's very important. We live with a lot of chronic inner homelessness, living in a time in which many, many factors tend to drive us from that sense of being at home with ourselves. And some of those forces are entertaining and interesting, and others of them are just the nature of our fast-paced society. But how often do we actually come home to ourselves? And there's a saying that all sickness at bottom is homesickness. There's some consequence to not being at home with ourselves minimally, mentally, if not even physically over time, as the health risks of slowly accumulating stress pile up. Interestingly, as we come home to ourselves off the field for that minute or 5 minutes, maybe just a few minutes before bed, before falling asleep, we gradually grow strengths inside, which then enable us on the field to be stronger, to be more capable, to be more centered in ourselves, less pushed around by the forces there, more able to watch certain reactions arising in our own minds and catch them before we act them out in ways that hurt ourselves and other people. So yeah, I would highly encourage everybody to find your own way of homecoming. There is this 5-minute challenge that I think of. I can tell you what it is. It takes 5 minutes
Yeah,
today.
please tell us.
Yeah.
Share. I want to do it.
Yeah. Oh, and then I should add too, on the field, in the flow of everyday life, slow down to take in the good a few times every day, a few breaths at a time. Slow it down. Why not? You're having that experience, or the good fact is actually occurring. You've earned it, or you've lucked out. Either way, it's here. You're feeling more connected to some other person. You're having a sense of your own gritty strength. You know in your heart that you do love your kids, even if they annoy you, right? It's there. The song's playing in the inner iPod, right? Why not turn on the recorder for a breath or two or three and let it really land inside yourself?
Is it just being present? Like I'm thinking of like a good moment. Like let's say you hug your kid and there's just like that beautiful moment that you have, right? Is it just taking a breath and just observing how that feels and, just trying to be in that moment rather than to try to, time travel to the future or the past or whatever your mind might do?
That's right. Neurons that wire together, fire together, wire together. But it's also true that the vast majority of our useful, beneficial experiences leave no trace behind. They're transiently helpful or enjoyable, but they don't persist long enough, or more exactly, their underlying neural correlates that are their basis don't last long enough to begin to transfer into long-term memory, especially emotional memory, somatic memory, not so much memory for episodes, events that occur. That's called explicit memory, recollections, but actually the gradual internalization of emotions that become moods, of intentions that become our motivations over time. That's what sinks in. So that's really kind of it. You're just trying to help the normal, natural processes of learning broadly in your brain so that you really learn from, in the broadest sense, beneficial experiences. We're designed to learn. The brain is very good at learning from bad experiences, and it's relatively bad at learning from good experiences, even though learning from good experiences of various strengths and useful moments is the primary path to growing good strengths inside that help us deal with the bad.
Man, the brain screws us up. It's wired all wrong.
Well, it's wired for life in the Stone Age. Yeah, in very harsh conditions.
To survive.
Yeah. Okay, so we're a 5-minute challenge, right?
Yeah, 5-minute challenge. Sorry.
It'll take less than 5 minutes to describe it. And people can just taste it if you want, just as I'm talking about it. So 3 parts to it. First part, every day, a handful of times for a breath at a time or more, slow down to take in the good. So just have this attitude. Okay, I'm going to try it. As I go through my day, I'm going to register any kind of beneficial experience from time to time. Basically, I am relaxing as I exhale. Slow down and feel it. Your cat crawled into your lap, or your dog came over, your kid, whatever it might be, you got something done. There was a nice email. You accomplished something. Slow down and take in the good. That'll take you about a minute a day, a minute or two a day max. Okay, right there. So there's no excuses. We all have time to do this. Second, know one thing in particular you're trying to grow inside yourself these days. This is very useful. If you think about the challenges you're facing of one kind or another outside you, what would help if it were more present in your mind routinely? Either running in the background or something you could draw upon, like a background feeling of self-worth or a greater sense of calm with a lot of stresses you're dealing with, maybe with this time of the coronavirus and economic disruption, a greater sense of patience and thankfulness, at least for the good that still exists, whatever it might be. What's that you want to grow in yourself? And it also could be related to your own personal history. Briefly, for me growing up, for example, there was an absence of empathy in my family in this kind of loving, decent home, but not very much empathy. So I didn't have much sense of being really seen or valued in my home. And then also I skipped a grade and have a late birthday. I was a young, dorky, shy kid going through school. I felt like a total outsider, a total loser. A lot of absence there of normal, healthy social supplies while I landed in adulthood with what felt like a hole in my heart, an absence, even for an introverted person like me, the feeling of being valued and appreciated and included. So I deliberately then started looking for experiences of what had been missing so I could gradually hardwire them into myself today. I could gradually fill that hole up from the inside out today, bit by bit, drop by drop, experience by experience along the way. And people may have a similar sense of something they're trying to develop in themselves, or they're wanting to heal or wanting to give themselves. Okay, what's that? I call it the vitamin C. It's as if we have scurvy, we need vitamin C. It's nice to get B's, it's nice to get iron, but you need that vitamin C. What's matched to that issue? Okay, that'll take another minute or two. Now we're up to about 3 minutes a day. Then sometime each day, maybe just before bed, come home to deep green. What I mean by that is a metaphor again, the green zone distinct from the red zone. You said earlier, fight, flight, freeze. That's the red zone. Sometimes we got to go into the red zone, but Mother Nature's plan is for us to move out of it rapidly and come home to green. That's why, as Robert Sapolsky put it in the title of his wonderful book about stress, why zebras don't get ulcers. They go into red zone spikes that, as it said, most episodes of stress in the wild end quickly, one way or another. Right. And then the zebras that get away from the lion, most of them come back to the green zone and start eating grass again within a minute or two. But we humans live in the pink zone, if not mild to moderate red zone stress much of the time. On the other hand, the green zone is one in which there's a felt sense that there is an enoughness in the meeting of our three fundamental needs for safety, satisfaction, and connection. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you're safe enough in the moment. There you are sitting in bed the last couple minutes before you put your head on the pillow. You're basically all right now. You're basically okay. There's a basic sense of safety, so you can drop into a growing sense of calm and peacefulness. Also, there's a basic enoughness with satisfaction. There can be a thankfulness, be nice to have more, but, I'm not starving. There's a lot in my life that can foster a natural, authentic sense of contentment with what I have, thankfulness and contentment. And then connection. There's an enoughness of connection. Try to find it if it's true. Not a perfect marriage, but pretty good. Not a perfect parent-child thing, but pretty good. There's an enoughness there. And minimally, there's open-heartedness and compassion and friendliness in your own heart, whatever might be missing actually in what you're getting from the world around you. So you can drop into a sense of love broadly. So there you are, you're just kind of hanging out in a sense of calming, peacefulness, gratitude, contentment, kindness, open-heartedness, love, deep green, and just marinate in it for a minute or two to strengthen the neural circuitry of the green zone, deepening that quality of resilient well-being inside yourself that's unconditional increasingly. It's not contingent. It's not based on external forces and factors and conditions. And also, as you come home to the deep green, you're healing the wear and tear you've accumulated over the course of the day through kind of chronic stressful drivenness in the pink zone. So that's my 5-minute challenge.
Mm-hmm. I love it. I love it. It's not easy being green, Kermit used to say, but I think maybe it's easy being green.
It's our home.
Yeah.
It is our natural home. Actually, it's our equilibrium condition biologically as well as psychologically. And yet, alas, we spend a lot of time, homeless and chasing one shiny object after another. We're very vulnerable to the manipulations of fear. And we see that locally in families and schoolyards, and we see it politically through authoritarian demagogues throughout history, certainly. So be careful about thinking that it's threat level orange when for you, actually locally, it's not. And be careful about the tendency to move into rancor and resentment with other people and say what you need to say, admit fault and move on, or make the point about what you want. Make a request and move on, turn complaints about the past into requests for the future and then see what they do. Judge accordingly, as best you can, right? Don't let yourself dwell. Where we dwell becomes what dwells within us. We dwell chronically in resentment and drivenness and anxiety. That's what will become the habit of our heart.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if we dwell routinely in genuine, authentic sense of calm strength and thankfulness and, healthy, ordinary pleasures and, a sense of healthy connection with other people, that then will become the habit of our heart.
Right. I love this. So much to take in here. Okay, I'm going to let you go. I just have one last question about your writing routine because
fun to talk about.
What is your routine? You must have a routine. You've been doing this for so long and you do it so well. Do you have a certain way that you approach writing each time, or is it different each time? Or
My one foray into high culture, kind of each 3 months, is the Paris Review, right? And I want to be really clear. I'm not very highbrow, but it's a neat entry, including the interviews. Like, for example, I'll skip over a fair amount of the poetry and fiction, although I'll always find things that just light me up. But the interviews I always read, like, what is the process of writers? So you're exactly right. How it shows up for me is I am pretty task oriented. So if there's a task to do, I've tried to help myself learn to want to do what I ought to do that I don't want to do.
That's interesting.
That's a very useful thing. And
because most people don't really want to write, that's because it's hard. So it's hard to motivate yourself to even do it.
Yeah.
So how do you get yourself?
That's right. So let's say there is a thing to do and I'll want to do it. And I'll kind of motivate myself by focusing on the anticipated rewards of it. Or I will recognize that I just have to do it, even if the topic isn't my favorite thing. And I'll recognize that, more friction, more suffering. The more I resist the way it is, the more I'm going to suffer. The Buddha made this really useful distinction between the first and the second dart. The first dart is sort of the inherent discomfort or pain physically or emotionally in something. Like there you are, you've got to do it. It's not pleasant. Your back hurts a little bit. You still have to sit and keyboard and grind it out. You'd really rather be playing with the kids or watching the game on TV. You just got to do it. That's the first dart. But we don't need to add second darts to it. Of being mad at ourselves, mad at our editors, complaining, fighting, so forth. Okay, so I'll, in my own process, just to be quick here, I'll know what there is to do. And then what will happen typically is structure is a friend of the nonfiction writer. I do nonfiction. Yeah. And structure, like location in real estate, really, really helpful. So the most useful class I ever had in 25 years of one kind of schooling or another, which is bizarre to reflect on because I made some missteps in grad school, which extended it different ways. Speech and debate in high school. I really learned to think in an outline form. Yep. And so I'll form it. I'll see the outline. I'll often make some very rough notes. And then I'll just sit down and, in the page, I'm able to write under, as long as it's relatively quiet, under almost any conditions at different times. When I'm under deadline or I've got to do a significant amount of writing, I will really carve out time for it because I recognize if you don't have the time for it, you just won't get it done. There are only 168 hours in a week. You have to decide how you're going to allocate them, and you just have to do it. The last thing I'll say is that it really served me a lot. If I knew I was going to write something or I wanted to aim toward, let's say, a book, I would deliberately do or commit myself to doing things that would be half an hour here or 2 hours there each day that would gradually accumulate the first drafts of sections of that book. So if I was going to give a talk and I would use PowerPoint, let's say, so generating my slide sets, those bullet points in the slide sets would then become the topic sentences of the paragraphs that I knew I was going to eventually have to do, but they were going to give me a prompt. And it is really remarkable for a lot of people that if you just give it 20 minutes a day, an hour a day, 2 hours a day, adding up over time, 5 days a week, let's say, it really can accumulate over time, especially if you're going after a book. And to finish out, for example, you might ask someone, can you write 500 words? Can you write 2 pages? Decent first draft, just as Hemingway put it, write drunk, edit sober. Just get it on the page. That's really important too. Disengage the critic. Have the critic, put the clutch in so the critic
get it on the page.
It might turn, but the transmission's not engaged. It's just muttering in the background, but it's not consequential. Just get it on the page. Get it on the page. Get it on the page. Well, okay, can you get 500 words on the page? Okay, great. Can you do that 100 times? And that's a book. Bingo, 50,000 words. You can do that. Just do that. Sit down. That's 100 times you do it, maybe over the course of a year, and you can write a book that way.
From your lips to God's ears, for sure.
Little things add up over time.
They really do.
They really do.
They really do.
And have your own rhythm. Like I'm writing something now. It's hard for me. It's an academic paper, which I'm less trained in. And so I think there are times where you just set it aside, then you come back to it. I love the part of writing. That's that final finicky, polishing.
The rewriting is fun.
Yeah, I really enjoy that part.
Yeah, because you've done all the hard work. That's just the polishing it up.
Did you ever see the film Ring of Fire, the Johnny Cash biopic?
Oh, right. Yes. With Joaquin Phoenix.
Exactly. And Reese Witherspoon.
Yep.
I love it. And there are these sort of archetypal scenes in movies or in literature, like Gandalf at the bridge of Barad-dûr. You will not pass. These are these moments that are iconic. Okay. Well, a scene probably in that film where the young Johnny Cash rolls into this music producer in Nashville in like 1955. And this kind of grizzled guy, he's seen everything. And this is Johnny's big moment. Sink or swim. So he plays the song, sings, and the producer interrupts him and says, I've heard that song or one just like it 100 times. Look, if you had one thing to say to someone that was the most important thing in your life to say, and the chips were totally on the line. It reminds me of the Eminem, Lose Yourself, that rap song, that moment, feel it. Do you have a song like that?
Yeah,
and Johnny
exactly.
looks at him like, well, yeah, actually, I do. And then he plays Folsom Prison Blues, The Train Going By, bingo. Yeah. And that's the beginning for it all. So in us, almost everyone has something in your bones is true, and it matters. And it's important to listen to that voice and say at the end of the day what's really important to say, and to just put it out there. Message in a bottle. That's what's under your control. You can make your offering and bring some craft to bear, have some people look at it, think about the audience, think about the constraints. But at the end of the day, once we make our best offering, it's out of our hands. And there's a lot of noise and irrationality in the response of the market. There's so many examples of phenomenal pieces of writing that were not recognized at the time or really were meaningful to a certain audience, but were never picked up by the mass. And there are many examples of stuff that are picked up by the mass that become popular in various ways that we just look at them and go, meh, and, they'll disappear actually after a year or two. So at the end of the day, for me, it's like, I want to do the absolute best job I can and primarily judge it, evaluate it, feel good or bad about it based on the effort I put into it. And for me, the sense of it having quality. And then after that, it's mostly out of your hands. Be at peace.
Be at peace. Well, wise words from Rick Hanson. Rick, thank you so much for taking time off of your sabbatical to speak to us
and
share all these words. It's really wonderful to meet you. And I hope to have you back when your next book comes out. We could talk about that.
Oh, thank you. I'm just kind of reflecting here on all those people really throughout history before literacy, let's say, 5,000 years ago. And then certainly in the last, 100 or 200 years when, there's a lot more access to being able to generate texts, I think of it as a noble process. It takes courage. Yes, there are those people whose intentions are malign. Yes, the propagandists, the people who speak actually in bad faith, the tricksters, the worm tongues, to draw on the Lord of the Rings metaphor. Yeah. But most people, whether we agree with them or disagree with them, approve of their view or disapprove of their view, they're speaking with good intent. They're doing the best they can. And it's scary to express yourself. It takes effort to express yourself. And there's something, to me, kind of noble in the gradual accumulation of the chorus of human voices over the centuries, embedded in libraries, embedded now in the World Wide Web. Everybody now has their own possibility of a publishing house and broadcasting station and their own personal website, which I think is great. The democratization of voices, and all that. And we belong to we who write, we who speak, we who sing, we who make art. Right? It's generative, it's noble, it's honorable, and we can take refuge. We can find refuge in the knowingness in our heart of that.
I think that's just the positive feedback we need to hear right now.
And it's true.
To counteract all the negative feedback.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's terrific. Well, thanks again. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you so much for listening to Right About Now, hosted by my dad, Jonathan Small. Please leave us a review in your podcast app, share with a friend, or join our online community at rightaboutnowmedia.com. You can send John your questions to his email address, jonathan@rightaboutnowmedia.com. If you're not super creepy, he may even get back to you. On behalf of John, our cats Seymour and Thatcher, and the Right About Now crew, this is Ella, hoping that you do the right thing.